5, 4, 3.
All right, and we're back. If you notice, it's me again talking about the Nicomachean Ethics. We're in Book 5, Chapter 1, this video. And if you notice, this video, there's a bit of a different look to it. As you can see, it's a bit of a more open space thing. I can have a little bit more freedom to walk around, and also I can even stand to the side and let you familiarize yourself with the new territory. Now, we've changed studios, and so I'll be coming to you from this one for a while, and it's kind of appropriate because the tenor of the book now, the feel of the book, that is the feel of the Nicomachean Ethics, is going to change a little bit. Aristotle is talking about justice. This is a bit of a, shall we say, a different kind of virtue, and it's a nice transition to the rest of the book, because Aristotle is going to start moving away from just talking about individuals and what you do for your own self. Remember, we're all talking about trying to get to eudaimonia, this sort of elusive notion of what's the best life, happy life, good moral life, and so on. And I remember as an undergrad when reading the Nicomachean Ethics and thinking about it, and I always thought, this is a curious book, a curious text as a whole, that is, because we're talking about happiness, and I always thought, well, it's supposed to be about morality as well. But all Aristotle's doing is talking about the individual and sort of himself or herself. Hasn't really talked about other people. Even though in earlier books, if you recall, even the section on Aristotle's notion of certain kinds of polite values, the virtues that you would have, that you would demonstrate, let's say, in the context of tea time with Aristotle, if you recall from an early video, when I talked about that, it was really about what the individual does to make him or herself look better in front of others. And it's to the individual's benefit. It wasn't really making yourself look better so that you would be really benefiting other people. It was still the notion of a self-centered notion of virtue. And I thought, oh man, that's really selfish. But I think that was an earlier view of mine, and that was wrong to call it selfish. It's more of a beginning sort of self-centered, developing yourself, worrying about yourself first, putting yourself forward and doing certain things with yourself in order to become a truly virtuous person and work your way up to the virtue of justice. Much as when you think if you're sitting on an airplane and they give the announcements at the beginning and the safety talk at the beginning, you're always supposed to put your own mask on if something happens, your own oxygen mask on. Put your own on before you try and help someone else out, right? And why is that? Well, you got to get everything stable with respect to your own behavior before you can try and help others or even be concerned about others. And I think that's really the way to read the opening books of this work we call the Nicomachean Ethics. So it's not really selfish, but it is arguably self-centered, at least quite a bit to begin with. Now, as we've seen in the earlier books, there were some theoretical issues, remarks on methodology, and the definition, of course, and discussion of character virtues. There were, all discussions of these individual virtues, again, more or less talked about in terms of individual-based virtues. But that's going to change here, and we're going to be looking at a larger notion of virtue, justice. Now, if we go back to one of Aristotle's great teacher, Plato, in the work The Republic, which many regard as Plato's main work, he asks the central question, what is justice? Right? Now, in the Republic, there's a number of discussions. As a matter of fact, there's not really just one theory of justice. There's arguably a couple, and they don't really necessarily agree all that well, although people try and see if they can find ways to combine them. But it's a complex question, so I'm not really dealing with Plato here, just to make you realize that this was an ongoing topic of concern. That is the nature of justice. Aristotle will refer a little bit to some of his predecessors and their views on justice, which he thought were interesting, but a little too simplistic. In other words, Aristotle will raise the question of justice and regard it as multidimensional, multifaceted. And we will see in this discussion of justice that runs for the entire book, book 5, I'm just doing chapter 1 here, but he's going to show us that there are a variety of ways to understand justice. They ultimately fit together, but it's not just one single thing. It's a multi-dimensional concept. All right, so Aristotle sets aside the focus of the individual, and he's going to look at the virtue of dikaiosune, which is justice, and adika, which is injustice. So that's going to be his central one. And he's going to take his starting point by looking at adika in terms of trying to figure out what that is and use that as a springboard for talking about justice. Now, and once again, not surprisingly, we're going to see Aristotle make all kinds of distinctions and judgments and whatnot. As I've mentioned many times, Aristotle is arguably one of the first philosophers to introduce a lot of technical machinery into his discussion, and sometimes coining words and using them in different ways. All right, so chapter 1. He's going to give us his starting point. He has a rough starting point. People say that justice we've seen this, namely that virtues are regarded as dispositions, right? Tendencies to do things. So justice is a disposition that makes people not surprisingly. Justice is a kind of disposition, and remember, a disposition is like a tendency of the soul, of psyche, right? A tendency of soul to do certain things. A disposition is a way of behavior, right? Part of your character, shall we say. And a disposition of justice makes people do just things. So not surprisingly, injustice is going to be a disposition as well, a different one, of course. Makes people do unjust things. All right, that's pretty straightforward. Not exactly terribly explanatory, but again, we're back in the land of dispositions of soul. This is going to be sort of a smaller sense of justice. Aristotle will unpack these. He's going to start talking about general justice and particular justice, general injustice, particular injustice as well. So a bunch of subdivisions are going to start happening. Now, remember, it's important that you distinguish between dispositions and capacities, passions, and whatnot. A disposition, remember, it differs from a capacity. Okay? Dispositions are different than capacities. Dispositions you can think of as tendencies to do things. Capacities are abilities to do things. So tendencies and abilities aren't quite the same thing. They're not radically separate, but they shouldn't be identified. So let's think of it, let's make this a little bit clearer. Like a capacity, we can, for the sake of this discussion, capacity like an expertise. So how is a disposition different than a capacity? Aristotle says that a capacity is indifferent with respect to contraries, and dispositions are not neutral with respect to contraries. Now, that sounds a lot more complex than it needs to be, but think of it this way. A capacity or an expertise. So let's just look at a simple example. Expertise in something like dentistry, right? You could pick any expertise in bridge building, expertise in all kinds of things, expertise in driving a car. It doesn't really matter. So expertise in dentistry, it's really, shall we say, neutral. The pure expertise, right? Because in that sense, it's neutral with respect to its contraries, neutral with to contraries, and those contraries will be, shall we say, simply put, fixing teeth, right? That's what a dentist does. You have problems, and she comes in and fixes your teeth, or tells you how to fix them, or how to take care of them, or whatnot. But the whole idea of fixing, maintaining, all these kinds of things, that's part of the expertise. But also, what Aristotle's point is the other contraries of like, I don't know, ruining teeth. The pure expertise, according to Aristotle, is neutral with respect to these contraries of fixing or ruining. You can think of it this way. If you wanted to know how to ruin teeth the quickest, what's the best way to do the damage, to do heavy damage to your teeth, go ask a dentist. They would know, right? They would know basically what's the best way to take care of your teeth, what's the best way to damage them, so because a lot of people may have misguided ideas about brushing your teeth or whatever. You look back in people used to, for instance, in the Elizabethan era, people used to brush their teeth and use honey. And we know today that's a very bad idea. So the notion of an expertise is that it's a neutral. It's like a neutral piece of knowledge. It's like knowledge in the very neutral sense that you could use it for one way or use it in a different way. And sometimes colloquially we would say, use your knowledge for good. Right? Use it for the end of doing something to improve the lot of humanity or something like that. But of course, you could use it in a different way. Think about when mystery writers write their mystery novels, right? They often consult, forensic doctors and people in the know to say, okay, well, who would be the best person on knowing how to keep you healthy? Would be somebody like a doctor, and the best way of, how poisons and all these terrible things would work, it would be a doctor. So the capacity, shall we say, again, the expertise is neutral with respect to the contraries. So you can figure that in this sort of the claim of more or less that this sort of knowledge per se is rather neutral, right? You could use it for good, use it for evil. Well, a disposition then, so these are not neutral. A disposition to the good is not neutral with respect to doing good and doing bad things. They do not relate equally to contraries. So in this case, a disposition are not neutral, like a disposition, for example, a disposition to health, to use Aristotle's example, will not be neutral with respect to doing healthy things and doing unhealthy things. If you have a disposition towards health, you're going to do things that are proper, like going for healthy walks and eating healthy foods, etc., etc. So it's not something that is neutral. Aristotle then, after he lays this out, he raises the question and uses a term we've seen earlier, the notion of homonymy. And he says, we speak about justice in a variety of ways, like we do many terms. We use justice in different ways, just like we use other words in different ways, and we have to be careful that we don't confuse the various ways that we use justice with each other and end up making all kinds of mistakes. Certain words, like let's say bank, where you put your money, and then a bank as in, let's say, the side of a river or whatever, those words used like that don't tend to confuse us because the meanings are quite different. But when it comes to justice, Aristotle says the variety of ways that we use the word justice, some of the differences themselves may not be that great. And when that is, the differences in the meanings of the way we use the term justice may not be that great. And so in that sense, it's easy to get things confused. So justice, again, Aristotle is saying, has a variety of meanings. So, since it has a variety of meanings, You must be careful. Right? Careful about all these meanings because it's easy to get them confused. Okay, so we're going to use dispositions of one kind to understand other kinds. So we've got two dispositions happening here. Disposition of justice, disposition of injustice. And Aristotle, in a couple of the books, a couple of the chapters in Book 5, will use the disposition of injustice as a starting point for understanding the disposition of justice. So that's just a technique. He says that it's, we can use them. Sometimes it's an easier thing to understand. So it's often easier to understand the notion of injustice before you understand or try to understand the notion of justice. So Aristotle starts here with a couple of senses of the unjust. And these will be developed more throughout the book 5. But Aristotle is introducing some terms, and he's going to flesh them out, especially in later chapters in Book 5. So let's talk about Aristotle's couple senses of unjust. The two senses of unjust. There is the two senses of unjust. There's the person, he says, that who breaks the law, right? So Aristotle's going to talk quite a bit about law in this chapter, and he's going to use the notion of law to help break up this concept of justice so that we can understand it again in the large sense and in the limited sense. So the unjust person is someone who breaks the law. So, right? So the person who breaks the law, and the other, and this is kind of the large scale notion of injustice, right? Someone who is breaking the law. We regard that as quite serious. In everyday language, right? We say people will do things, and remember, Aristotle is very concerned with ordinary everyday language. He often starts his discussions from those. Everyday language, we do talk about people being unjust, right? And this is the heavy one. This is the big one, right? The person who breaks the law, like he violated the notion of justice, because, as we'll see, Aristotle will talk about this, where we regard our laws in our society as a fundamental expression of justice. So a person who breaks the law, this is the heavyweight. This is sort of the large scale. This is going to lead into notions of general justice. Okay? And notions of general justice really are going to be more for the politics. So this book, that is Book 5, is more or less referring to what's coming in the next entire text, that is, the politics. So this is sort of the heavy, large-scale one of a person who breaks the law, and fortunately most people in society really don't do that, right? Most people, because if they did, everybody would be breaking the law all over the place, and usually laws more or less reflect what people do. If everybody broke a certain law, chances are you wouldn't have that law anymore. So laws often reflect what people actually do. So, but the second sense of unjust or doing something that is unjust, or an example of injustice, is what Aristotle calls the unfair-minded. He has a variety of terms, and in a variety of translations, you'll get different sort of nuances of Aristotle's original term. But in this sense, it's the person who is kind of grasping, always trying to get more for himself or herself. And a person who is grasping, trying to get more for himself or herself, Aristotle says, what are they really doing? What's going on when we say to someone, oh, you're always grasping and trying to get stuff? We're really saying something like this. We're saying that the grasping person is trying to get, as we would say, more than a proper share. More than, hey, you're always grasping, you're always trying to get stuff. You're trying to get more than your share. So sometimes some translators say unequal minded, the person who is grasping, trying to get more than his her share. So this is sort of the small particulars of injustice. And in that sense, it's more or less an unfair person. You can think of unequal-minded, grasping, unequal-minded. All of this really is the unfair person, right? It's offensive, it's bad and all that, but it's not like quite like full-on breaking the law. That seems to be a much more severe notion. So this is more along the lines of involving particular issues of particular justice. Or in this case, it perhaps would be a bit better to say general injustice and particular injustice. So the notion of justice then is going to break up. It's going to be broken into particular and general. And Aristotle will lay these out a little bit in more detail, especially in the next chapter. So the lawful person then, so you can think of this way, then the lawful person, that's going to be the just person. Okay? Someone who's obeying the law, we would say that's a just-minded person. And the unlawful person would be the unjust, would be committing an injustice. The lawful person also, I can add here too, is the lawful person obeys the law, and the lawful person is equal-minded, doesn't try to get more than his or her share, is a fair-minded person. So we could put that in here too. And then you just flip it. So the unlawful, the unfair is the unjust. All right, so this is more or less, Aristotle says, how we talk. All right, so Aristotle then goes off and starts asking and discussing, because he started off with law. Right, the law. All right, so he goes and he starts gives, shall we say, a theoretical, right? A theoretical discussion, a theoretical analysis of the notion of law. So a theoretical discussion of, shall we say, the very idea of law. All right, so that's his next thing. He's gone through, he's used this notion of law to help sort of lay out a notion of general justice, or breaking it as general injustice. This notion sort of a smaller domain of law between individuals, as you know, when you break those, that's trying to get more than your share. That's a particular injustice. So the whole theme of justice is going to be involving some kind of balance and fairness, right? And how people should get what is sort of appropriate for them. Now that's where Aristotle is going to be quite different, have different views than we do today. Not in the sense of that he doesn't think there's a sense of general justice, but who gets what benefits and according to what. He's going to have more qualifications built in than we do in terms of things today. So in this theoretical discussion of the law, let's go back to that. What's he after? Well, he's talking mainly in his theoretical discussions the aims of law. So what is law really all about? What is it aiming at? Well, in this sense, he says, okay, let's think about the art of lawmaking. Not necessarily a given legislature or a given parliament or whatever, or Congress or whatever. Not really talking about that. He's just saying, what's the goal? What do we set parliaments up for? What's the idea of a parliament? What are the aims of law? Why do we have law in the first place? What's the point of it? What is it supposed to do? Because it's supposed to do something. Laws are not inert. They're like, shall we say, constraints. And they're not always necessarily constraints on bad behavior. They're constraints on behavior. And for instance, if you had a community of angelic beings that needed, for some reason, to drive cars, you'd still need rules of the road. You'd still need some traffic laws, because if you didn't have them, you could get into all kinds of, the angels would be crashing into each other, and then you'd have all kinds of problems with insurance and things like that. So even a community of angelic beings would need some kind of law, right? Some kind of constraints. So again, don't read constraint purely as in curbing bad and terrible impulses. Constraints are also things that provide order. So in terms of laws in the sense of scientific, empirical, physical law, those impose an order on the universe, right? So in that sense, the aims of law really, at the sort of the theoretical level, what are they about? Well, Aristotle says that we first off, when we talk about the art of lawmaking, or sometimes it's translated as the science of lawmaking, it's really the propositions that are articulated. They are the law or the laws, and we say those are just. Those are expressions. So the aims of law really are to express justice, right? And what exactly, how they're going to work could differ, and Aristotle will talk about how certain expressions of justice will be universal and some are local, and this gets into a big, this is within the big context of the Greek struggle with notions of general laws and individual laws. We'll talk a little bit about that in later chapters. But for now, it's the expression of justice in our society, and we say that the laws that are articulated by this law giving, the idea is to express justice, and so they are just. Now, laws govern behavior. As I said, don't always interpret that as bad, just getting rid of bad behavior. It's also, in a larger sense, as I gave you with that goofy example of angelic beings driving cars, what is it? It's to provide order, right? Again, like natural, empirical laws of physics, they provide an order to the universe, and you hear physicists talk about we can understand that order. So the same thing at the aims of law here are to express justice and to bring order. Right? That's what laws really are about, right? And don't we think about the ordinary way we talk about law. Think about areas of human activity where there could be bad things, there could be good things, or whatever. Like some areas of activity on the internet. Some stuff is terrible, some stuff is maybe not terrible, but it's a little bit just sort of haphazard. And so people will say things like, well, we got to bring some laws in here to regulate things. Why? Because laws will help, maybe catch the people that are doing bad stuff, but it also makes things more harmonious. It brings order, right? It helps bring harmony. So one of the intents of law, it's to express justice, but it's to bring order and harmony to what? Well, to basically a community of sorts. That's what laws are intended to do. They're to bring order to communities. And Aristotle says, well, it has an aim at a communal interest. So the idea is to bring order or harmony to a community by looking at and aiming at collective interest. Right? Or the collective goal, or however you want to phrase it. But the notion of what is going to bring more harmony by binding people or linking people or bringing people together, however you'd like to put it. But that's the aim of law. Again, this is all a theoretical, because you might be thinking, wow, that sounds nice, but lots of laws don't do that. Of course, Aristotle would have recognized there's bad laws and good laws and et cetera, et cetera. Now this goes, and this is more or less in a tradition of discussing law, the philosophy of law, and of course, by no means does this tradition end with Aristotle. It goes off and it's with us today, and it has a long and illustrious history. But Aristotle is doing a little philosophy of law here. Now, we would say then, when you sort of putting all these concepts together, that the idea of bringing order, harmony to a community, looking at collective interest, trying to express this collective interest in some kind of propositional form, a linguistic form that we can understand, this whole thing is going to lead to, not surprisingly, this is going to be leading towards making people happy, leading to happiness. And of course, we've seen this notion in terms of sort of a not a great translation of our old friend, the term eudaimonia. So when something aims at bringing, another way to put it is when something aims at bringing harmony, we call it just. And that's what the law does. Now, laws make all kinds of demands, right? So the goal is maybe ultimately to make us more happy and to have harmony, but that's not all they do. Laws impose demands. So we're still doing the theoretical, we're still looking at Aristotle's theoretical notion of law. We've seen that it aims at this collective interest, imposing, bringing about, developing, making people happy because they're in a more harmonious environment. But the theoretical sense of law, it also aims at something that's truly important, that we don't talk about this so much anymore. Some people on different political stripes will talk about it. Some people are horrified of this notion. But that what is the law supposed to do? Is, again, it's not just to curb our bad sort of impulses, as I gave you with the driving angels example, but the notion of law is also possessed, shall we say, it contains a moral dimension. Because in the theoretical sense of law, it also makes demands on us. Not just demands to curb our bad behavior, not just demands to make it so that we get along with each other better in terms of driving on a certain side of the road or stopping when a light is a certain color and going when it's a different color, and be careful when it's an amber light or something like that. But it makes specific demands, namely, it makes moral demands on us. Ideally, the law does make moral demands. Aristotle says, think about it. What does the law do? It makes moral demands on you in many ways. Think of it. It makes moral demands because it asks, basically it demands, right? Insists, in some cases, that we be virtuous. What's an example of that? Well, Aristotle would say in certain times of danger to the state, you live in a community that is threatened. Aristotle would say something like, well, the law is going to demand of some of its citizens, not all of them. And again, this would be an example of a certain subset of society with a certain set of interests that have to be governed in a certain way, but it's reflective of what the whole society might have as an interest. If a community or society is under threat, the law would ask certain individuals to be virtuous, to be that, i.e., to be what? Virtuous? Courageous. Oops. Courageous. And how, in what sense? Well, they may have to go to war. Might be a draft. Or you might be called up. The country needs you, right? It's the law. You got to go, right? You got to go and defend the state. So there's an example of in the theoretical sense that the law makes demands on us, not just for order or whatever, but certain moral demands that it would say you have to be virtuous. In this sense, it would be a character virtue, right? And we've seen the character virtues are getting a grip on your emotions and putting them and getting them in the right mean, right? And remember our discussions of the mean, it's not a mathematical mean, but you might have to train so that you become and you develop this virtue of courage in times of war. So it would be by law that you have to be courageous. You don't have a choice. So you get sent off to boot camp or something and you're trained to be a soldier with the virtue of courage. Other times it may ask, where you have to, be temperate. All kinds of things, right? For instance, the law might say something like, think about the way the laws work. If you have to be temperate or moderate-minded in some proper way, if someone breaks into your house where the law does not allow you to just do anything to defend yourself. You can't, just do anything you want. There are restrictions. So, sometimes it might be requiring you that you leave or you do other things. The particularities aside, the point is that in certain circumstances, the law makes moral demands on us, saying that you have to be courageous in certain situations or temperate in others. So the law has a moral, shall we say, from our perspective, a very important moral dimension to it. All right, so ultimately, what's the law really about? So again, in this theoretical sense, so in sum, the law is really a mechanism, right, that its goal is to produce a unified community. All right, so in sum, it wants to produce a unified community. And this unified community is going to have moral people in it, virtuous people. So the law, ultimately, in the large sense, is to increase the virtue in the community. All right, so Aristotle, of course, is aware. Once again, I mentioned it earlier, but I want to stress this. Aristotle is not naive. He's not saying that all expressions of justice are just fine and they're great, and not saying anything like that. He definitely regards some expressions of justice as better than others. He has no problems with that. Aristotle is no cultural relativist that he just thinks, oh, well, all expressions of justice are equally fine or whatever, or you can't say anything. It's just a different expression of justice, or there's no such notion of justice. There's only individual expressions, and we say one's just, and that's what they do, and this is what we do, and there's nothing else to say. Aristotle's not like that. He's not a cultural relativist in that sense. So he would say that there are definitely better expressions and worse expressions. There's better laws and worse laws. So that's already hinting at the distinction between some sort of natural form of law and artificially imposed law. And we'll see this in this book in more detail. I just want to make a few points before I wrap this video up here. So justice in this large sense. So let's just make a few concluding points here. Justice in this large sense. Make a few comments on this. Of the whole community. This is complete virtue. Aristotle calls this complete virtue. Okay? So it's not really clear exactly what he means by that right away. But it's complete virtue because to have justice in this large sense is to be virtuous not only in the smaller way, right, about yourself and, don't be a glutton, don't be this, do this in polite society, etc., be courageous, be temperate, and all these things. Those are sort of the smaller notions of virtue. They're important, they're necessary, they're not sufficient, but they're necessary parts of virtue. This justice in the true large sense of it, justice is the only virtue that is directly concerned with others. So justice is unique because it is directly concerned with others. So in this large sense, you have justice is directly concerned with others. This is like the big notion, the complete notion of justice. And so you're virtuous towards yourself, and you're virtuous towards others as well. So this is the shift, right? The earlier virtues, all that talk was really just about virtue towards yourself, right? Don't eat too much because that's bad for you and things like that. But this now we're talking about virtue exercised in the presence and only in the presence of others. So it's a more social notion of virtue. So the best, or you could think of it this way, could you really be just if you were, kind of doing if you were marooned on a deserted island, right? You're all by yourself on a deserted island. No other human beings are there. According to Aristotle, could you really be just or unjust? Not really, right? Maybe today we would say, sure, you could, if there were non-human animals around and you treated them badly, you would be unjust with respect to them. Well, that's fine, but you would still have, Aristotle would say, okay, well, I don't necessarily quite agree with all that, but he would say you're still bringing in a social dimension to justice because you've brought another subject in. What if there were no animals, right? Non-human animals. So you're the only sentient life form, right? Maybe some people would say today, and a lot would, as a matter of fact, that you could be unjust towards the plant life if you just went and torched it all or did something like that. So, but again, you would be ascribing a certain kind of subjectivity or moral capacity or something, moral agency of some kind to the other, and then you would be doing something that could be regarded as just or unjust. All right, so it's a social kind of thing. So directly concerned with others. So justice in this large sense has a social dimension. So there we go. We're moving from justice in the individual part that we talked about earlier to the larger one. And this is really the complete. So the best person, according to Aristotle, the best person, right, is going to be someone along the lines of who exercises virtue always in relation to others, justice in the large sense, not just with respect to him or herself. So in this sense, justice in the large sense is the complete notion of virtue. The worst person is going to be exercising in that sense, like wickedness with respect to himself and his friends, right? Always doing wicked things, taking too much or lying, deceitful kinds of behaviors. And this is vice, right? So so for Aristotle, you wouldn't be a completely vice-ridden person if you were good to other people, but not so great with yourself, right? That would be, you'd have some vices, but if you're bad with yourself and bad to other people, then you're like, that's the whole of injustice. That's like the vice-ridden person. But if you're good to yourself, right? So it's important to be good to yourself and good to others, then you're the best kind of person. That's justice in the complete sense. That's the whole of virtue. So Aristotle's talked a lot about justice, yes, and the whole notion of justice in terms of the large sense, the whole of virtue. In the next chapter, so once we get into chapter 2, Aristotle's going to dig a little bit more deeply into this. And he wants to make it a little more precise, and his precision in the next chapter is going to show a little bit more of what he's concerned about with respect to justice vis-a-vis the Nicomachean ethics, and how justice will be of a different sort of concern, but important as well, in the next book, which of course is the Politics, and we'll look at that in later videos. So roughly put, Aristotle wants to distinguish between justice in the larger sense, general justice, the whole of virtue, and justice in the narrow sense, particular justice, which is a part of virtue. So particular justice then. So particular justice. What exactly does that mean? Does it really exist? What are we talking about? Aristotle, in the next chapter will focus on this. And so what we'll do when we look at chapter 2 is to dig more deeply into the notions of particular justice according to Aristotle. See you in the next video.